have that. Right, this brings me to my final and most important section of the speech. And yes, this is what we didn't get in Wellington. What can we do about it? Indeed, is there anything we can do about it? This speech is entitled New Zealand is not for sale, and cynics might suggest that is because there is nothing left to sell and or because it's been given away, not even sold. I'd be mad to deny that there is an element of truth in that, but rest assured that there is plenty more to be sold in this country. Just ask Rodney Hyde and his big business mates what else they'd like to get their hooks into. And never assume that once something is gone, it's gone for good. Look at what happened to both Air New Zealand and the railways. Sold overseas, not once but twice in the case of the railways, and renationalised in both cases. And new realities can be created to partly make up for what has been lost. That was the reason behind the creation of KiwiBank, which is one of the great success stories of the past decade. All three of those cases demonstrate that with sufficient political will and plain old-fashioned gumption, nothing is impossible. The situation is far from hopeless. In fact, there is plenty that can be done to fight back, and more importantly, is being done. Now, to illustrate the point, I'll refer specifically to the campaign to stop the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, TPPA. But what I'm about to say applies equally to the campaign to stop the privatisation of public assets and the whole issue of the recolonisation of New Zealand by transnational corporations. As I've already said, this is not coincidental, I'm making this tour in election year. That gives all of us the opportunity to employ all of the tactics with which we've become familiar when we've used them about any number of other issues in previous elections. Firstly, we need to wage an educational campaign to inform our own members and supporters and the broader public about the dangers posed by the TPPA and for them to then lobby the MPs and candidates about it. This is the 1 year and free that politicians are acutely sensitive to public opinion, or at least have to pretend to be. We need to think of ways to exert pressure on them on this issue, which is one with very broad implications. Now, sometimes the oldest tried and true tactics can be stunningly effective. For example, during the 2008 election campaign, Kafka circulated a humble little postcard for people to send to MPs, ministers, candidates, opposing further liberalisation of the Overseas Investment Act and urging that it instead be tightened up. It was a runaway success and even succeeded in becoming a major media story as a result of it getting up the noses of very senior figures of both major parties who went ballistic about it. I got rung up with the media saying, well, there's questions in Parliament saying, who's behind this secret campaign? Is it the exclusive brethren, possibly? So I was actually identified on that night television news as, quote, the culprit. They said, here is the culprit. So here I am. That's it, the culprit, eh? So we're doing something similar this year. So we've got a postcard, actually, here. And help yourself to ones over there. So somebody said the other night, can you boil this long, boring speech down to something succinct that we can actually do about this? So here's a postcard, and there's no stamp required. You can send one to John Key and one to an MP of your choice, any party. Dear Prime Minister Key, I urge the government to withdraw from negotiations for the TPPA and instead put New Zealand's national interests at the heart of all trade and investment negotiations rather than the interests of transnational corporations and the US government. And then there's a series of bullet points about what's wrong with the TPPA, and it concludes, I will be voting for a party which puts our national interests first, not those of foreign corporations under a TPPA. So that's fairly succinct. So if you think, oh God, he said something, what do you talk about when you go out tonight? So that's it. That's pretty succinct, actually. So we'll put that over there. So that's something that anybody here can do. Now there is the fact that MPs will not get a vote on the TPPA, not until after it's already been signed anyway, which is New Zealand's standard procedure on free trade agreements and treaties in general. But actual and wannabe MPs can't wriggle out of it that easily by saying that it's beyond their control, nothing to do with them, they don't know anything about it. They don't know anything about a lot of things, apparently. They are asking us to employ them as our representatives in the business of running the country. There is no bigger issue this election year than the TPPA, because it will impact into so many areas of our economy, our society, our culture, and our everyday lives. So every politician of every party has to be put on the spot about which side he or she is on. Are they for or against the TPPA? To me, it's an issue comparable in national importance to the 1981 Springbok tour, and that everybody in the country, whether they wanted to or not, had to form an opinion and come down on one side or the other about that. Now, we're nowhere near that level of public awareness yet about the TPPA, but this year presents the perfect opportunity to put it on the political agenda, to make it an election issue, and to put all politicians on the spot about it. Because it has such wide-ranging implications, that gives our campaign an immediate point of reference with a number of others, such as groups fighting to retain MMP at the referendum accompanying the November the 26th election, groups fighting on water and regional democracy issues in Canterbury. Our Water, Our Vote group has already joined up with the New Zealand Not For Sale campaign. Groups opposing the Auckland Super City, whose fears have only been partly allayed by the election of Len Brown as Mayor in the centre-left council. That was definitely not in Rodney Hyde's grand plan to corporatise Auckland local government and hock off the juiciest portions to his mates. It gives us common cause with medical sector unions and health advocacy groups in relation to Pharmac and the US wanting New Zealand patent laws tightened, specifically in relation to drugs. Common cause with food safety groups, and the Safe Food Campaign is already a member of the New Zealand Not for Sale campaign. Groups opposing genetic engineering. And internet freedom advocacy groups, maybe also internet service providers, because of US demands for tougher laws on accessing and copying digital recordings. When the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade called for submissions on the original proposal to expand what was then called the P4 agreement, a number of individuals, groups, institutions and businesses did so, many of them about the issues involving copyright and intellectual property rights. That aspect alone affects the likes of libraries, universities, internet service providers and the digital technology sector. Already some groups representing people like authors have started to grasp the implications that the TPPA has for their members. People and institutions that don't normally ever have to think about free trade agreements are being forced to do so because this one will affect so many aspects of life in this country. Now I'll single out the very big and extremely important health sector for special mention here by way of example. The TPPA targets not only Pharmac but also ACC and proposed restrictions on cigarette packaging and sales. It will also have effects in areas such as foreign ownership of aged care chains, health and safety rules for products and health qualifications. That opens up the potential for our campaign to link with the existing campaign to keep ACC as a publicly owned asset. The government has started the process of privatising it. To link with the various unions, such as and interest groups fighting to retain quality care for residents and decent wages and conditions for staff in retirement homes. It's worth noting that one such chain, Bupa, was runner-up in the 2010 Roger Award. And most significantly, enable us to link with the powerful and extremely well-organised tobacco control campaign. I've worked with them before when a tobacco transnational, British American, won the Roger Award. Another tobacco company, Imperial Tobacco, was third in the 2010 Roger, and I can vouch for the fact that the tobacco control campaign are a determined and resourceful campaign with a long history of fearlessly confronting some of the nastiest global corporations of them all, companies that make their money by killing their customers and addicting replacements. We don't need to reinvent the wheel with this campaign, we've been here before. I've already commented on the similarities between the TPPA and the aborted multilateral agreement on investment of the 1990s, which was defeated by an inspirational campaign, both national and international. There were some key features of the New Zealand campaign against the MAI that haven't yet shown up in our campaign against the TPPA, and we need to learn from those. For a start, two parliamentary parties, one from the left and one from the right, namely the Alliance and New Zealand First, campaigned very hard on the issue and ensured that the MAI entered mainstream consciousness and got on the political agenda. When it was defeated, Jim Anderton, God bless him, claimed the credit. In fact, those two parties were only benefiting from the hard work of dedicated campaigners, some of whom were involved in the TPPA campaign, such as Jane Kelsey. But the fact is that having parliamentary parties pick up the issue and run with it was invaluable. Now, we have one in our present campaign, namely the Greens. It would be good to have at least one more on our side. Ideally, that would be Labour, but Labour has always been missing in action on the whole issue of free trade. That was the case with the MAI and remains the case with the TPPA. It strikes me as being a perfect issue for the Maori Party, at least for the Flex Roots members, if not for its brown Tory MPs. And that brings me to the second crucial feature of the MAI campaign that hasn't yet shown up in the TPPA campaign. Maori played a huge role in defeating it. There was a whole campaign entirely within the Maori movement and the Maori community in general that really got mobilised, educated their own people about the dangers of the MAI and really got stuck in, including a nationwide series of hui and a high-profile hikoi that attracted big numbers. Maori are our natural allies in this campaign, not the corporate leadership of iwi and their big business structure, but ordinary working Maori people who always suffer the most from the transnational corporate agenda because they're the ones at the bottom of the heap. I reckon that the danger that the TPPA poses to tightening tobacco control in New Zealand is a reason all in itself why we can build links with Maori to fight the TPPA. Tobacco has a singularly deadly impact on Maori, particularly on Maori women, young Maori women, and there has been a uniquely Maori fight back against the tobacco transnationals in recent years. They have led the way with the tobacco control campaign. You can say what you like about Honi Harawira, but there's no greater zealot than a reformed smoker, and he's just got stuck into them big time. There is a flyer over there about the treaty and Maori. I was invited, I had no idea, I was taken straight off a bus in Wanganui the other day by a feisty Maori nun and taken straight out to speak to overwhelmingly, it's Sister Margareta, exactly, I hadn't seen since the 90s, she can out-talk me, one of the few, so she whipped me straight out to this Mariah and she said, "You're going out there to talk to community health workers or something." I said, "What about? You know, what's all this about?" And so I went into this room, people were sitting around crying. I thought, my God, what's going on here? It was the end of a 3-day workshop on the pain of colonisation. I'm not sure they wanted me as a comedian or something to come in, but so I spoke to them very brief summary of this stuff, and they just lapped it up. They grabbed all those bloody postcards, they cleaned out about half my stock, and they sat there writing them. And I said, don't forget the Maori Party MPs. I said, oh no, we're not forgetting them either. And so they thought, this is wonderful. And that was the only Maori audience I got to speak to, but it really resonates. You don't have to explain to Maori about colonisation. They know all that stuff. And when you explain this will impact on your attempts to get rid of the scourge of smoking from your community, they lapped that one up too. And it was overwhelmingly Maori women. That's the movers and shakers at the grassroots or the flex roots in that community. And the third crucial difference is that the campaign against the MAI and the various bilateral trade agreements in the 90s between two countries put on a lot of work with local government, nowhere more so than in Christchurch. We lobbied and educated council officials and councillors about the MAI's very negative impacts on their assets and operations. It worked. As a direct result of CAFCA, in the person of myself and Bill Rosenberg, lobbying one key committee of the Christchurch City Council, that committee recommended that the full council declare itself against the MAI, which it did, and furthermore the Christchurch City Council then wrote to every other council in New Zealand recommending that they declare themselves to come out against the MAI. And a number of them did so, which really pissed off MFAT, I can remember. They started holding special briefings in Christchurch for the Christchurch disease. This was repeated in relation to some of the bilateral trade agreements also. Now that was the high point of our ability to positively influence local government, and things have changed somewhat since the 1990s. I don't see Bob Parker being particularly receptive to our campaign, for example. He wouldn't have to take his Parker off. Councils now don't have the committee structure that they did then. They have been depoliticised and are now run like boards of a corporation. But the bottom line is that they're all comprised of politicians and susceptible to persuasion, particularly if there are votes in it, or more importantly, the threat of loss of votes. Wouldn't it be great if Auckland Super City, whose voters so spectacularly refused to deliver the outcome that Hyde and Key had set it up for, came out against the TPPA? What about Wellington's new ballroom dancing, fiery-tempered mayor? I mean, all of these trade and investment agreements have major implications for local government. It is the job of our campaign to alert them to it and get them to come out against the TPPA. Important as it is to lobby politicians and generally engage with that whole parliamentary process, that is a top-down and essentially passive approach, asking our elected representatives to actually represent us. You don't need me to spell out the whole history of betrayal, sellouts, compromises and flat-out lying that is involved in the past. So it's not enough to trust politicians to do it for us, or even rely on a change of government to make it all good. We have to do it ourselves. We need some people power in New Zealand. We've seen it in spectacular action in the Arab world this year, but they're very different societies. But within our country, we have seen, and continue to see, right this week in fact, the most magnificent grassroots mobilisation and community action in response to the seemingly never-ending earthquakes crisis in Christchurch. There we have witnessed ordinary New Zealanders, students, farmers, women, workers, the unemployed, brown, white, take charge of things in their own streets, neighbourhoods, suburb and city, rather than helplessly waiting for somebody else to do something about it. Just to single out one group. I speak as a student activist from decades ago, and one who was cynical about the calibre of today's young people. I stand in awe of the Student Volunteer Army, which mobilised somewhere between 10 and 20,000 Canterbury students to get stuck into the most basic of tasks, namely digging the city out from under the ocean of silt and muck and shit that engulfed it. And now it's being done, I see, by the high school student army, because the other students are back at university. Now what I'm talking about is an emergency response to a life and death catastrophe, and not what is commonly perceived to be a political issue. But in actual fact, there is nothing more political than spontaneously organising people at the grassroots level to take control of their own communities. New Zealanders care very deeply about our communities and our country, despite the best efforts of the ideologues to turn us into a dog-eat-dog society. That people power is a truly formidable force. To conclude, and I really will be concluding now, I think you'll agree with me that we have a huge number of potential allies for the campaign to both expose and defeat the TPPA. The trick is to convince them that a trade issue is also their issue, and for them to join the campaign to defeat it. This, of course, is a two-way process and involves us helping them in their specific fight. We need to build links between different campaigns while also drawing in people who haven't previously been involved in any kind of activism. That simply demonstrates the old adage, which is true as ever, unity is strength. Education and action are the keys to building a broad-based national campaign that, in partnership with our international allies, can and will enable us to defeat this latest assault on our sovereignty, our democracy, our economic well-being and our national identity. Time, as always, is of the essence, so let's get stuck in. By extension, this also applies to the campaign against privatising public assets and the whole big issue of fighting the transnational corporate recolonisation of Aotearoa. We're all dealing with symptoms of the same disease, and it's the disease that we need to tackle. We're confronting the most powerful institutions in this country and in the world, but we've beaten them before and we'll beat them again. They're the ones that have to hide inside a fortress of secrecy and lies. We have nothing to hide, and the truth is on our side. We are many and they are few, and that's it.